The Sacred Psyche, a psychological approach to the Psalms. Edward Edinger. Editor's foreword. In answer to Job, Jung urges those who can to bend to the great task of reinterpreting all the Christian traditions. For many years, Edinger dedicated a goodly portion of his creative energy to that great task. The Sacred Psyche is the seventh and last volume in his effort to fulfill the assignment he had accepted, and the number 7 is of great psychological significance. At his death in July 1998, he had taken his work as far as he could. Although he would be the first to say his was only a start, he has laid the groundwork for others to build on. Originally, Edinger envisioned the Sacred Psyche as an amply illustrated book discussing all 150 Psalms. For the lectures presented in this book, he narrowed that down to 15. 8 months before he died, Edinger and I spoke of the importance of putting those lectures into book form, and he again briefly considered including all the Psalms, but his energy was spent. After his death, I knew that his work on the Psalms must be published, so with the support of Daryl Sharp and Diane Kordick, Edinger's partner, I took up the task. Edinger presented his material in differing ways in at least 2 seminars, one in the spring of 1983 at the Jung Institute in San Francisco, one in October 1984 at the Centerpoint Conference in Nashua, New Hampshire. Thanks to the generosity of Diane Kordick, I have had the use of his concise handwritten notes for the lectures, with their many textual amplifications. These made his intentions clearer to me than might otherwise have been the case, and enabled me to weave the versions together into a coherent whole. While the rest of us see dimly through foggy glasses, Edinger's vision is clear, precise, eloquently presented. In his remarks on Psalm 1, he gives us the etymology of the word Torah, to throw out a finger and point the way. When lecturing, he often uses the phrase, "You see," wherever possible. I have kept that phrase in the text. He's pointing the way for the rest of us, helping us to see what he sees so clearly. Edinger knew keenly the appropriate place of the ego when exploring the mysteries of the self. As Jung says, because of his littleness, man must, in order to survive, always be mindful of his impotence. With this in mind, much as Jung used a personal feeling voice in answer to Job, I have kept, whenever I could, Edinger's own informal language. My thanks go to the Detloff Library in San Francisco and to the Centerpoint, now in St. Louis, for copies of the tapes from which I transcribed Edinger's spoken words. My thanks also to Peggy Sugars, who, with others, originally transcribed the San Francisco version. Edinger's work is of vital importance to many people. Among them are 4 to whom this book owes a great deal. Marilyn Ray, with her gift of language and her deep experience of the psyche, has been a steady and invaluable overseer of the project. Karen Thorkinson not only solved many technical puzzles for me, but also, with sensitivity and comprehension, contributed greatly with her editorial eye. In addition, without the warm support of Diane Kordick and Daryl Sharp, this book could not have come into being. My greatest debt is to Edinger himself, teacher, colleague, friend. I first met him in 1984 at the Centerpoint Conference. I was stunned then by his presence and by the depth and clarity of his work, an impression that has only grown stronger in the ensuing years. Now as I read his commentary on Psalm 1, the Blessed Man, I feel the holiness he speaks of there also describes his own life. He was indeed consciously and appropriately related to the self. In the Sacred Psyche, Edinger speaks of his work as a translation from the traditional Judeo-Christian context to a modern psychological one. The original preface to the King James translation of the Bible, published in 1611, contains these lines. Translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell, that we may eat the kernel, that putteth aside the curtain, that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well, that we may come by the water. This is what Edinger has given us, the opportunity to drink living water. Introduction. In Mysterium Connectionis, Jung writes, any renewal not deeply rooted in the best spiritual tradition is ephemeral, but the dominant that grows from historical roots acts like a living being within the ego-bound man. He does not possess it, it possesses him. Jung tells us here that every individual psychological development with any depth to it, not just an ephemeral tadpole in the puddle of life, must be connected to the best spiritual tradition. Certainly the best spiritual tradition of the Western psyche is based on the Judeo-Christian scriptures. That means then that we are obliged to assimilate this great archetypal treasury to the new psychological Weltanschauung. We dare not remain disconnected. We must reinterpret it in terms of our modern knowledge of depth psychology, and it is this purpose that lies behind my study of the Psalms. Joseph Henderson has recalled Jung saying in a private conversation that he read the Bible not for its religious content, but for its marvelous psychological content. That's what I have in mind here. The Psalms occupy a unique position in the Bible. On the one hand, they contain the distilled essence of the Hebrew Scriptures. On the other hand, they prefigure the image of Christ and provide a bridge to the drama of the Christian passion. I think it could be said that if we lost the narratives of the crucifixion, they could be reconstructed by an imaginative elaboration of the Psalms, especially Psalm 22. The more I study the Psalms, the more impressed I am with the fact that the image of Christ is embedded in them. The Psalms are the prayer book of both the Jews and the Christians, and as the Psalms themselves tell us, Yahweh dwells within them. Psalm 22:3, referring to Yahweh, says, Thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praises of Israel. And the Psalms are a book of praises. Psychologically, this means that these texts embody the living presence of the self. Yahweh inhabits the Psalms because clearly they were written out of multiple encounters with the numinosum. Therefore, they have the power to constellate the archetype of the God image in those individuals who are open and receptive to their influence. They can lead one toward the experience which generated them. I've discovered, in fact, that one appreciates the Psalms most when dealing personally with the same psychic depths they record, and it may very well take a psychic crisis to experience their value. I have known several quite irreligious people who were astonished to discover that certain Psalms were the only thing that spoke to their condition during a period of grave psychic upheaval. They found companionship there, evidence that someone had been in the same place before them, and the value of such companionship should not be underestimated. I must tell you that the Psalms are the heaviest material I have ever dealt with psychologically. I've worked on classical mythology, alchemy, the Old Testament and the New Testament, but none of these have had the weight that I felt working on the Psalms. Sometimes, after dealing only briefly with one image, I would be utterly exhausted. It was as though I had been lifting huge boulders. That was the image that came to me, and in fact, I think something of that sort is what happens. That's what we do when we work psychologically on this kind of deep material. We attempt to pry these great psychic megaliths, these huge stones, out of their religious context in order to make them available for direct experience. But this effort does involve moving great weights, and it's no easy task. I offer these remarks so you can be on the alert to see for yourself whether you experience a similar fatigue. One might say that the archetypal images so relevant to the individual Western psyche have been built like great slabs into the vast edifice of traditional Judeo-Christianity, into the whole dogmatic, liturgical, and ecclesiastical structure. A collective edifice of immense proportions. It has housed the Western psyche for 2,000 years or more, but it is in the process of collapsing. It is falling into ruins. The precious stones that have gone to make it up must now be rescued and built into a new structure, much as the stones of the pagan Roman temples were quarried in order to build Christian temples. There is a difference of scholarly opinion concerning the dates and authorship of the Psalms. By all objective criteria, they are an anthology written over several centuries by various authors. Nonetheless, tradition assigns the authorship of the entire Psalter to David, and certainly the book is a unified work, breathing the same numinous spirit throughout. Thus, from the psychological viewpoint, we can consider the traditional single authorship of David to express, if not a literal fact, certainly a psychological one. The designation Psalms is derived from the New Testament and has its origin in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, where in one codex the book of Psalms is called Psalmai. In another codex it is called Psalterion, referring to the harp-like instrument called a psalter or psalterion, which was used to accompany the singing of the Psalms. The Hebrew name for the Psalms is Tehillim, meaning hymns or praises, and that term derives from the word Tehillah, which means to praise. So the Psalms are a book of praises, and that theme becomes particularly evident in the final Psalms, where nothing but praise is mentioned. I'll speak more about that when we talk about Psalm 150. We have several images that come together here. First, we have the basic idea of praise to Yahweh, that the Psalms were sung carries the feeling of poetry and the power of constellating the unconscious in the way poetry does. And then there is music. As the psalterion is plucked during the singing of the words, so too are the strings of the soul. As far as the traditional appreciation of the Psalms is concerned, I don't think a much better one can be found than the one given by Luther. It was he, who translated the Hebrew scriptures into German. Listen to what he says in the second preface to the German Psalter. This was written in 1528, and there's something quite remarkable in it. There you look into the hearts of all the saints as into a beautiful gay garden, indeed as into heaven. And in that garden you see spring up lively, bright, charming flowers. Flowers of all sorts of beautiful and joyous thoughts about God and His mercy. Again, where do you find words expressing sorrow more deeply, and picturing its misery and wretchedness more tellingly than the words that are contained in the Psalms of Lament? Here you look once more into the hearts of all the saints as into death, indeed as into hell. How dark and gloomy it is there, because of the grievous spectacle of the wrath of God, which has to be faced in so many ways. Again, wherever they speak of fear or hope, they use such words that no painter could portray either fear or hope with equal force, and no orator could fashion them in like manner. And the very best thing is that they speak such words about God and to God. This explains, moreover, why the Psalter is the favorite book of all the saints, and why each one of them, whatever his circumstances may be, finds in it psalms and words which are appropriate to the circumstances in which he finds himself, and meets his needs as adequately as if they were composed exclusively for his sake, and in such a way that he himself could not improve on them, nor could he find or desire any better psalms or words. To sum it up, if you want to see the Holy Christian Church painted in glowing colors and in a form which is really alive, and if you want this to be done in a miniature, you must get hold of the Psalter. And there you will have in your possession a fine, clear, pure mirror which will show you what Christianity really is. And here's the interesting thing to me. You will find yourself in it, and the true Nothi Soten, know thyself, and God Himself and all His creatures too. I was startled to find Luther striking this modern psychological note. Well, I read that because it's part of our best spiritual tradition, written in 1528, but it is one-sided, and I must try to balance it, because although it's a beautiful and profound appreciation of the Psalms, it is an old-fashioned attitude. To balance it, I must mention some of my own past attitudes and reactions. The Psalms have always been difficult for me. I haven't liked them. They have a kind of pushy piety that rubs me the wrong way. And I don't think I'm alone in that reaction, because I believe modern Western culture has had rather enough of ostentatious religiosity. Our religious wars, our inquisitions, our self-righteous preachers of religious certainty, they all have generated a healthy skepticism concerning facile talk about God. When I am in that mood, cool Greek reason once more has considerable appeal. This is what makes Augustine's Confessions so uncomfortable to me, and I think to a lot of people. He puts us off by his easy familiarity with God, and also by a kind of psychophancy to the deity. How refreshing it is, by comparison, to read Jung's answer to Job. My view is that we must be true to our modern Western reality, and to the empirical standpoint that has created psychology. At the same time, we must do our very best to integrate material that derives from the traditional sources. The fact is that there is a sacred dimension to the psyche. Deity does exist. The sacred psyche is an empirical reality, and we must seek it in its natural habitat, where it lives. The Psalms themselves tell us that Yahweh inhabits the praises of Israel, and so we must study the Psalms. One stumbling block in the Psalms is the rough, almost primitive nature of the relation to God they express. They have an archaic quality. That roughness, that uncouthness is very uncomfortable for rational levels of consciousness. Yet it is this very archaic quality that transmits the power and the depth of the Psalms. Experience teaches us that the numinosum is encountered in the archaic levels of the psyche. It is not something pretty and finally differentiated, not the God of philosophers. It is a whole different thing, barbaric, infantile, and abysmally unscientific, as Jung acknowledges in a letter to Erich Neumann. That level of the psyche can be found in all of us, provided one is able to penetrate deeply enough, and it is from just that level that the numinosum emerges. The more deeply one goes into the material, the more the feeling of distaste I mentioned earlier dissipates. At the basic level, one profound experience deepens another. There is a wonderful Jewish legend about the function of the Psalms. The more contact I have with these legends, the more impressed I am with their psychological wisdom. They supplement all the biblical accounts with an accumulation of exceedingly rich lore. It is as though the collective psyche, in order to enlarge the implications of the traditional biblical material, has woven all this lore to amplify the initial images, much the way one amplifies a dream image. Here is an example. When King David's workmen began to build the house of God, they dug the drain for the altar very deep and inadvertently lifted the shard on the mouth of the abyss. Instantly the waters of the deep began to rise and to flood the earth. David knew that unless the mouth of the abyss were sealed again, the world would be destroyed. He also knew that only a stone with the ineffable name upon it could seal the abyss. David lowered the stone with the holy name on it, 16,000 owls, and tightly sealed the mouth of the abyss. But it was soon discovered that the earth below had lost its moisture, and even the rains were not enough to grow the crops. King David then composed 15 psalms, and as each psalm was completed, the waters of the deep rose 1,000 owls. When the waters reached within 1,000 owls of the surface of the earth, he offered thanks to God, who keeps the ground always moist enough for the crops, and does not allow the abyss to sink 1 iota below or rise 1 iota above 1,000 owls. I'm not going to try to interpret that. It is complete as it is. Now, a final note on the versions of the Psalms I will use. I think for English-speaking people, the authorized King James Version must be the standard one, because its venerable associations cause the archetypes to resound in a unique way for us. For full clarity of understanding, however, I think a modern version should also be used alongside the King James translation. The one I recommend is the Jerusalem Bible. In addition, one really ought to have some kind of connection with the Hebrew original. Those fortunate enough to be able to read Hebrew may feel that archetypal resonance much more powerfully. I have practically no Hebrew at all. I just barely know the alphabet. But I do have an interlinear edition of the Psalms, and with it I can locate and follow up certain Hebrew words that are especially significant. As you will see, I do that in Psalm 1 with the word Torah, for instance, and it does add a whole other dimension. The reason Jung put so many Latin and Greek quotations into his works is because for many modern individuals, the ancient languages constellate the archetypes. They have a mysterious quality not of the everyday. For that very reason, granting them some attention amounts to pouring attention into the unconscious. It is an effort to pay homage to the historical levels of the psyche, which are also the archetypal levels. With that in mind, I'll crawl my way through an interlinear Hebrew-English psalter to locate certain words. I should mention two other works that have been helpful to me in considering the Psalms. One is the 3-volume work by C.H. Spurgeon entitled The Treasury of David. This is a vast anthology, a compilation of what has been said about individual psalms and verses over a period of 4 or 5 centuries, and a wonderful aid to work with when you're examining some particular psalm. The other book I found helpful and meaningful is Augustine's Expositions on the Book of Psalms. He wrote a large volume on all 150 psalms, which is available in English translation. What's so remarkable about dealing with this kind of material is that the centuries just melt away, because essentially, Augustine is looking at the same text I'm looking at. He's commenting from his standpoint, and to be doing the same thing now on a much smaller scale, 1600 years just melt away, and it is quite an experience. That is what happens when one deals with the fundamental texts. It is like looking at the stars in the sky. The constellations haven't changed, so that what the ancients saw, we see. And so it is with these basic scriptures. What they saw, we see. It tends to generate a valuable sense of being rooted in the collective psyche. There is one more small but important item I should mention before we turn to the Psalms themselves. The term Lord, as used in the Authorized King James Version, is the translation for the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, which was thought too sacred to be pronounced. The Jerusalem Bible translates it as Yahweh, so when Lord is capitalized here, that translates as Yahweh, while Lord refers to the ordinary meaning of the word as master.